Okay, I want to give you guys a little bit more information about the qualitative research interview. So under the module with the PowerPoint about interviews, you see a couple of things that might be useful. One is a PowerPoint that goes over some of the points I'm going to talk about today, but I want to give you some additional context. And then there are also some links to some external resources to help you think about how to conduct interviews, how to craft them. And so that might be something to take a look at if you think you might propose using an interview when you're writing up part 3 of your grant proposal. So for now, let me just dive into talking a little bit about when you might use the interview method and what you can accomplish with it. So interviews, what are they? Why do them? Interviews are a strategy that can help you get at the deeper meaning of things that you typically can't get through a method like survey, right? Surveys only work really well for kind of short, to-the-point questions. Oftentimes they're closed-ended, meaning we've provided response options ahead of time along with the questions we're asking because it's too hard to analyze open-ended questions for a large amount of data. So surveys give you that sort of large, narrow slice of an issue that you may be looking at. Whereas interviews, you're certainly going to do fewer of them because of the resources required to do it, right? You probably need to talk to someone for about an hour on average in order to get much out of the interview that you can use. And then you need to analyze all that data. So typically we might only do 10 or 20 interviews, depending on how long our research program is and the kinds of things we're trying to understand. But it gives us much richer data because you've really unturned every stone by talking to someone in an extended way. The other thing about interviews is that we tend to use the information in an iterative way. Meaning you may do, 3 or 4 interviews about a topic and you start to notice that there's something that you hadn't really thought about before when you formulated your original research question. Or maybe some things in those handful of interviews are contradicting each other, and it's just leading you to ask new questions. So you go back and maybe talk to those people again after you have conducted a certain number of interviews and realize that you need more clarification. Or you may change and ask a few additional probing questions to your next set of 5 people who you interview. And then you might go back and reinterpret the first set of data you gathered. And so one thing that's interesting about the interview method is that it's kind of this interactive method where you're interacting with your research participants, but also with your data itself to constantly revise the way you're thinking and build your theory about whatever issue it is you're addressing. And so if you'll think back several weeks ago, back when we were in our physical classroom, we learned about inductive reasoning, meaning we actually build up from observations to our hypothesis. Rather than coming in with a set theory or a set hypothesis where you test one little piece of it to then go back and revise it, which is deductive reasoning, we're actually inducing, inductive reasoning, our ideas from what we learn as we go with qualitative research. So it's a big difference. Surveys, you're typically following a deductive process, right? Interviews are more inductive. But what's really cool is that we can use those 2 methods together to get the best of both worlds. So there aren't any set recipes, if you will, when you're going into a social science research project. And it gets even more flexible and interesting when you start thinking about participatory action and community-based research, because you always have to be evolving based on what your community-based collaborators are learning and what they're looking for. So I'm going to share my screen and get into a few more particulars about interviews. Okay, so here we are talking about interviews. So as noted, the interview, it's a direct method of research used to gather information for a specific purpose. Now, sometimes when you see guidelines about doing surveys and about developing a survey questionnaire, we talk about delivering that questionnaire in an interview format. For example, census takers going door to door and literally reading the census survey and recording the answers for you. So sometimes that kind of survey questionnaire can be called an interview, but that's not what we're talking about when we say interview method. They are not designed to generalize broadly about a population. And so everything we talked about with sampling when we talked about surveys, it doesn't apply with interviews. So how do you know how many interviews you need to do? Well, great question. The answer is until you've done enough, right? So you can actually be the judge along with your community-based participants of when it is you've learned what it is you want to learn. And so one way that I think about it when I do qualitative research is once I feel like I pretty much understand what's going on with the situation and I'm not uncovering new information and I'm not uncovering information that's contradicting information that I gathered before and opening up new questions, then that means I've more or less saturated my knowledge of the subject that I was researching, and I don't need to do any more interviews. So this is another way that the interview method is an interactive method in that you're constantly interacting with the data to establish a theory and to establish a working understanding of a problem. So I know that's not a really clear answer. Another limiting factor with interviews is your resources and your budget and your time, right? So if your funding is up, you can't travel, you can't get any more appointments scheduled, sometimes you just have to work with what you've got. But what's great about the interview method is that you have the capability to learn how people feel about things. You have the capability to really get at deep levels of meaning and to get lots and lots of information with every encounter you have with somebody, so that even if you've only been able to do a few interviews, you've probably still got really rich, meaningful data that you can use in your research. So a couple of scenarios in which you would want to use interviews are key informant interviews are really, really common. And so if we were thinking back to some of the topics in our class project around campus housing, there are a lot of key informant interviews that could potentially be really helpful. Key informants are people who have particular expertise over a policy or a program or an industry, an issue that you're trying to get to the heart of. So when I worked on my dissertation, I used key informant interviews to talk to people in the Department of Environmental Protection in the state of West Virginia because they were regulating natural gas extraction, and that's what I was studying. I also talked to a lot of oil and gas workers who were working in the fracking industry. So those folks, even though they're just, workers, they're not CEOs or anything like that, they're experts over their own lives. And so I was able to learn a lot about how the industry worked, which I needed in order to do any kind of more grand theorizing about the meanings behind why the industry is the way it is, or why natural resource extraction impacts certain communities the way that it does. Same thing if we were thinking about housing and the cost of higher education. We need to understand a lot of things about how the university budget works. Where do all of the tuition dollars and all of the room and board dollars go? How do they get redistributed back across to different functions in the university? Is the housing and meal program totally self-sustaining? Is there a profit margin associated with that? These are all things we would really want to know. We might also want to talk to landlords, homeowners around the university neighborhoods to understand, hey, how have your property taxes gone up over the years? How has the market around here changed in the past 20 years? What are the things the university has done that has made those things change? So those are more, informational interviews where you can get a lot of different people's perspectives on how things work and begin to get a much more rich picture than you can get just from looking at the budget that the university publishes or just from looking at the census data on median rent prices. So it's for those moments of getting richer information from your key informants. Another type of interview is really to understand how people are personally affected by things, where you really want to understand how a social phenomenon or social problem is working. And so this is where I might ask people who live in the neighborhood around UK about their feelings about how the cost of living has changed, how it has affected them personally, where you might ask your peers, your students who are facing some of the same issues as you, how have you been affected by this emergency change where we all had to suddenly leave campus, right? Did you get your refund back in a timely fashion? And how did that affect your ability to survive? And has that changed how you feel about higher education? And has that changed how you feel about capitalism? Right? So that's where we can use the interview not just to get more information about a subject, but to start to theorize about the wider world and how people interact with it and how we remake social institutions every day. So again, I'm going to throw it back to the beginning of the term when we talked about social constructivism. The qualitative interview method is really, really key to this theory of social constructivism, the idea that we create social life in concert with one another, right? Remember, we did this exercise and we talked about, our classroom, it could be a dance party, it could be a dinner venue, it could be anything. But the fact that we all chose to come into that classroom and sit in our seats, and I stood up like a professor in front of the class rather than putting on music and dancing around, is what made it a classroom. So we create the conditions of our reality, oftentimes with a lot of coercion, right? So like, I have to go to work every day in order to make money to pay the rent. However, if enough people stop complying with that, then you kind of push, you can collectively push for a change. And that's kind of how social revolutions have happened. When we think about the civil rights movement, for example, a lot of people did a lot of grassroots research using the kinds of methods we've talked about in this class in order to build their strategies and in order to make change in the 1960s. Same thing with women's liberation. Same thing with what's going on now. If you look at an organization in Mississippi called Cooperation Jackson, they are trying to build a totally different kind of economy from the ground up. And COVID-19 has made it impossible for us to reproduce our social situation in the same way that we normally do. A lot of us can't go to work anymore. A lot of us can't afford to pay our rent anymore. And if, you can Google on the internet, if you haven't heard about it, rent strike. A lot of people in the major cities are going on strike and just not paying their rent. So it's interesting how challenging times like this lead us to really see the way that social constructivism works. And aside from just sort of observing and reading about it in the news later, the interview is a way to get at people's everyday sense of reality and how different things in their lives are happening. So that's really the purpose behind the interview. And as you'll see on the next slide, those are the, sort of the conventional definitions you'll notice all across these social science definitions of the research interview, is that it's noted how useful it is to get the story behind people's experiences, and to do meaning making from those narratives. And one thing that's also really cool about interviews is that if they're done in a face-to-face context, you can gain a lot of information just from the experience of interacting with somebody. So I've had a lot of people end up in tears during interviews that I was doing around my work on land loss. You know, people who had lost their homes or had to leave their homes because of the environmental impacts of the extraction that was happening nearby. And that kind of interaction also adds a lot of understanding on our part, just through our human interaction. So one thing to note about interviews is to be prepared, if this is a method you ever choose to do in your work, to really sit with someone and go deep and be empathetic, and to understand that oftentimes when people start to tell their stories, it can be very emotional, especially when we're talking about social problems or social issues that are often very sensitive for people. A lot of times you get answers that you don't expect or that you're not prepared for with your interview. And so you have to be willing to kind of just be present with somebody, even if they're a total stranger. So on that note, there are a couple of different formats for conducting interviews. They can be either structured, where you have a guide that you make ahead of time with a list of questions that is very specific, and you follow that same questions in the same order every time you do an interview. There's also unstructured, which is totally free-flowing, and you might have a few themes. You know, you want to hit on a couple of concepts, but you're really just going to let the conversation happen naturally. Usually, it's best to have something in the middle. I tend to use semi-structured interviews where I have a list of questions ahead of time, but I allow the person I'm speaking with to direct the conversation and to have it flow naturally. It's definitely more difficult and takes some practice. I also really like to make sure that I still cover all the questions, but sometimes through the different paths the person you're interviewing will leave as they speak, they will touch on those questions out of the order that you would normally have asked them. Or they might have things that segue perfectly into another question that's maybe at the bottom of your list. And so you might say, well, tell me more about that in the context of XYZ. Another method that you can use is a cognitive interview, which actually asks a person to go through their usual habits, like what route do you take to get to work every day, right? And so you ask them all the things they pass and all the things they encounter, and that can give you a window into people's mobility and into their spatial lives. So for example, I had a friend who studied undocumented people's work habits and kind of access to public space in Boston. And he found that especially during a time that a lot of, there were some new policies implemented about 10 years ago that led to a whole lot of deportations during the Obama administration. And it essentially meant that local police departments were sharing information with federal immigration enforcement and vice versa. And so if someone got picked up for a random traffic stop, and oftentimes they could be profiled, right? In some states, this is when, ID laws came into place, so you could be pulled over, and if you didn't have ID on you, then you could be reported to immigration authorities then and there. A lot of these policies were being implemented at the time, and he was studying how that affected people's ability to get around. And people in Boston were taking different routes and avoiding certain areas where they felt they were going to be more highly policed, or more likely to be reported to immigration authorities. And by the way, under these laws, a lot of people were actually placed into deportation proceedings who were actually citizens or who were here lawfully. And so it was a risk even to people who shouldn't have had any reason to worry. And so people change their daily habits of how they get around. So asking somebody, what is your usual route? While it sounds like a really mundane question, it can be really useful for that kind of research. Another method that I use a lot, because I study people and their people's land access and land use, I often talk to people who are farmers. And so I'll have them walk me around their farm and talk to me about the land and what they usually do season by season and how that changes. And that can open up a lot of surprises, things that you wouldn't necessarily think is relevant to some of the things that I study, such as resource extraction. But if you remember that the land above an area where mining is happening always has some other use before mining happens, and then that use has to be cleared away. A lot of people end up having surveyors, folks come in to see where they could lay pipeline, and they might trespass on someone's farm. Right now, I have MetroNet is laying their high-speed internet cables around my neighborhood, and so they've come through my yard several times. But it's not something I usually think about. And so if I were giving an interview about a topic to do with my land and trespassing, I would not usually think about that. But if I were walking around and I saw those little flags sticking up, I'd be like, oh yeah, this is where they came through and did that, right? And a lot of times these cognitive approaches can be adjusted for more participatory settings. Yeah, it's just a way to get people thinking about what they do day to day and bringing that into a place to be examined in a way that it's usually not. Just like with survey administration, there's different ways you can get around to doing your interview. The best way is always going to be face-to-face, especially for personal interviews with people. You're just going to build a better rapport with people. It's a lot easier for people to talk about some of these more intense things face-to-face. But sometimes that's not an option, right? Sometimes you want to talk to someone who has a lot of expertise on your issue who's really far away, and it doesn't make sense to travel, or you can't travel. So in that case, you could do it over the telephone. Right now, a lot of social researchers are doing their interviews over Zoom or other kinds of web formats, because we can't see people face-to-face right now because of social distancing. So those are all, still in play as options. A few tips. You're always going to want to speak really clearly and avoid jargon that people don't know, right? So some of you may have read a little bit about neoliberalism as a theoretical framework for your research project. You wouldn't want to go into your interview and ask students, what do you think about how neoliberalism has affected housing at universities in an interview? Because they don't necessarily know what neoliberalism is. They haven't read those same theoretical frameworks as you. So you need to find more practical ways to meet people where they are, and then you can, it's on you to kind of make sense of it within the theoretical frameworks that you have, that you're doing the research with, right? So instead, you might ask people, what do you think about the layoffs that the president of the university just announced? What do you think about our dorms being outsourced, right? So these are all indicators of neoliberal policies that you can talk to people about. But it's much harder to talk about a really abstract concept that people don't know the words. The other thing to keep in mind is dialect. Obviously, people talk about things differently in different places, depending on where they're from. And when I'm in very rural places, I sometimes don't know the local dialects. When I'm in Ecuador, I sometimes don't know the local dialects or the right way to talk about things. And you have to be careful about not making people feel different or excluded because of the way that they talk about things, right? A lot of times academics, people with a lot of training in something from outside will show up in a community and talk to them in a way that just isn't familiar at all, and then will not really, will disregard what local people say because they don't really understand the local way of saying things. And so spending time and getting to know people that you want to do your research with is really important. Sometimes it takes time to build relationships. But even if you don't have that time or that ability, it's good to just be mindful that you may be talking to someone who's very different from you, and you may have to meet them halfway and go the extra mile. The other thing is to have an idea of how long the interview is going to take before you go into it. So try, to aim for no more than an hour, and then you can let folks know when you ask them to participate in this interview that it's going to be 30 minutes or an hour max. And then watch your time. And maybe you don't get to talk about everything you wanted to talk about, but you can't just take over somebody's day. And again, sometimes it's easy to offend people with our body motions, with the way that we say things. And so just being very delicate in the interview context. I can't reiterate that enough. And usually when I'm in class with folks, I do a practice interview exercise. And if anybody wants to do that in a Zoom meeting at some point, I'd be happy to. And I usually, have people formulate a few questions, and then they try it out on me first and then on each other. And I'll try to throw you off with things that would be unexpected, or that would challenge the way that you're using your body or speaking. And that can be a helpful way to kind of illuminate, here's what can actually happen in an interview, even though it might be rare. I think I've already gone through everything that's on this slide. So I'm gonna keep moving on. One thing to know, sometimes you'll get inaccurate information because people just can't remember things, or they just kind of make something up because they want to answer your question. Also, you can get bias, right? I mean, people often don't want to talk about some of their weakest moments or hardest moments. They may have ideas about what you feel and what you want them to say. Especially if you think about action research and you think about like the issue with campus housing. If people know right away that you have concerns or critiques of what's happened, and that's why you're doing your research, then they're going to assume you want to hear their concerns and critiques. When if they hadn't been prompted that way, they might feel great about campus housing. They might love all the new luxury amenities, and they might not care they're in debt about it or whatever. So you might get some bias to where the person is just trying to make you feel at ease. And sometimes there's just not a lot we can do about that, right? I mean, we try to recognize it and account for it in how we interpret things. But we also have to kind of take what people say to us about their feelings and who they are and their experiences at face value. So there is some preparation that you need to do for an interview. Oftentimes you really want to try to do interviews with as little distraction as possible, but you also want to make the person feel comfortable. So if that means walking around their home or visiting them in their home, not requiring them to travel to you, then maybe there's some distractions in that case, but it's worth the trade-off because they're comfortable. You always need to explain the purpose of the interview. You need to address terms of confidentiality. People need to know that what they share with you is not going to be shared with anybody else. You might use quotes. You might share the information with a research team, especially if you're doing community-based research and you have a group of researchers you're working with. And so you need to be very transparent about who all will have access to the information. One thing that is typically done is that any identifying information is removed from the transcripts so that at least anything that could be traced back directly to a person, you know, is not there in the interview. But even then, you know, if you're in a small community where people tend to know each other and you have a research team of people who are also from that community, there's not going to be any way to de-identify it. People may know who it is just based on what's being said. So you have to be really clear about what terms of confidentiality there are. You'll want to explain the format, you know, whether or not you want to just have an open-ended conversation or if you're going to ask a series of questions. You'll want to let them know how long it's going to take. Always give them your contact information. They may want to follow up with you. And I also think it's really important to share your research analysis back with the people you interviewed because they're giving you a lot of time and a lot of personal information. And usually people volunteer to participate in a research interview because they also think what you're researching is important and they want to contribute to it. So if they have contributed to it, you need to follow up with them and let them know what came of it. You also need to give space for the person you're interviewing to ask questions, to express any doubts that they have, any concerns they have, and you should try to address those concerns to the best of your ability. One concern can often be this next bullet, recording. So typically, because you are having a conversation with someone, it can be a long conversation, it's going very in depth, it's ideal if you can record the interview. And when you're writing a grant proposal, one thing that you typically will ask for is for money for, if you're using interviews, is a recording device. It is not recommended to record on your cell phone. Cell phones just don't have enough privacy features to protect people's personal data. So even though we all have the capacity to use our cell phone for that, we usually do interview recording on a dedicated voice recording device. And those run about $60 a piece. You'd be surprised. So you always want to get permission and let them know you're going to be recording. And you want to gauge, you know, even if they say it's okay, but their body language is telling you otherwise, you want to find ways to accommodate that if you can and make sure they understand that that recording is just for you to be able to go back and interpret what they said and to put it with the other interviews you're doing for the purposes of analysis. But if people aren't comfortable with that, and a lot of times they aren't, especially public officials who are speaking in their capacity as public officials don't have the same kind of confidentiality rights, and so you may be recording a key informant interview with a public official, and they're fine with making their public official statements, but they may have opinions about their role or their office that they want to share off the record. So you might have to stop recording, or they might just say, I don't want any of this recorded. Then you need to be prepared to take really, really detailed notes, which can be very difficult to take, word for word notes over such a long period of time and to stay engaged in the conversation, which is why it's really ideal if you can record, but taking notes is always another option. Sometimes people won't want you to do either, or you might feel like you just aren't able to take notes the way that you want to and participate in the conversation. And so the next best thing you can do after that is immediately after the interview, get your notebook or get your laptop and to the best, go through your question list and try to write out everything that they said that you can remember. You always think, things are so meaningful, you're going to remember it and you can do it later. Trust me, you won't remember. You have to write your notes right after you do the interview. I would also add that if you record your interviews, eventually you're going to need to transcribe them for analysis, and you shouldn't wait too long after the interview to transcribe, because when you transcribe, you can add notes about body language, about tone of voice, about things that happened in the room or that were going on during the interview that aren't necessarily captured in a voice recording, but can be really helpful later when you're interpreting things. And last but not least, what kinds of questions should you ask about in an interview? Interviews are good for getting at behaviors, so what someone has done or is doing. Where do you shop? How much do you spend on groceries on an average week? Opinions and values, what a person thinks about a topic, right? What do you think about the cost of living at the University of Kentucky? Feelings. This is not so much about what somebody thinks or about what they do as it is how they feel about it, right? So how did you feel when you couldn't afford rent this month, right? Knowledge, getting facts about the topic. Again, that's more like the key informant interview, but it doesn't have to be just key informants, right? Everybody has knowledge that they can share with you. So for example, your interview template on housing might be, ask for some information about what neighborhoods people live in, how much money they pay in rent and expenses, and taken together with multiple interviews, you start to get facts. Facts that, coming from people's own experience might contradict information that's being put out there by other sources that don't do these rich interviews. And then sensory, what people have seen, what they've touched. When I do research with people out in the field, I often will ask about the forests around where they live, about how the water has changed over time, how the ecology has changed over time. And that's all based on their sensory experience. So I think that's all I have on explaining interviews. You may be wondering about what you do with the data and how you analyze it. And that is something that is covered, if you scroll down to the very last module, covered in our module about coding and analyzing qualitative data. But essentially, it's really just a matter of systematically taking all this information and all these transcripts and trying to pull out the key themes that emerged, the things that seem important, and you just whittle down from there, basically. Um, so yeah, I hope this has been helpful in giving you a little bit more background information about interviews.